So yes, when I sat down to rewatch the Kite Runner, I was almost kind of like wondering if I put it at the wrong place in our timeline, because a big chunk of the movie, like 40% of the movie, takes place before Charlie Wilson's war in Afghanistan. Right. And then it kind of jumps ahead into the mid-'80s, still kind of concurrent with. And then it's really just the last probably third of the film that takes place in the year 2000, which is where I put it in our timeline here. But I still think that's okay.
Right. I think it's a good place to put it, too, because there's not too many... Actually, this might be the only movie I think that I've ever seen that actually shows, Afghanistan between the end of the Soviet occupation and then 9/11. Usually you get, one or the other. But yeah, this isn't. At the end of this movie, when Amir goes to Afghanistan, it's in the year 2000. So I mean, it's like right before 9/11, essentially, which is then when pretty much every other movie that is set in Afghanistan takes place.
Right. And I think what this movie does do a better job of, though, than Charlie Wilson's War, because that was more really from the American side, this puts you in the lives of the Afghani people, and especially when they are back in 1978. And we talked about it on the episode of Charlie Wilson's War, how modernized Kabul was before the Soviet invasion, and you really, really see this here. This almost seems like a Western country. Yeah. And then we kind of talked then at the end of Charlie Wilson's War how all they had done was open the door for the Taliban to move in, and then that's what we see when he comes back. So he escapes, the main character, Amir, escapes the country during the Russian invasion. We see him and his father escape. And again, that would have led into what we talked about in Charlie Wilson's War. And then he goes back to track down some family and friends, and the Taliban is in charge. And we see full on, like you said, right before 9/11, here is the Taliban. This is only about a 5-year window that the Taliban was actually in charge of Afghanistan. And it's harrowing. And just the juxtaposition between what life was like in Afghanistan in 1978 versus the year 2000. And it's just kind of beyond depressing. And I did mention the Kite Runner and Khalid Hosseini's novels in the Charlie Wilson's War episode, kind of forgetting that I had it further up on the list here. But I highly recommend... Actually, you know what? I'm going to say I highly recommend the books. This isn't a great movie. It's not a bad movie, but it's definitely not a great movie.
No, I agree. And this is one of the few times where I actually have read the book. Usually it's not the case, which I know for you is probably the opposite. You almost always have, if there's a book-movie combo, you've almost always also read the book. Is that accurate?
I would say I'm still probably under 50%, especially on this list.
Oh, not necessarily. I just meant like movies that you like that also have a book associated with them. You will have almost always read the book if you like the movie enough.
I don't know. I you know what? I've never actually examined that closely. We'll say yes to make me sound smart.
Okay. But yeah, so this is a rare instance where I have read the book, and I did really like it. Yeah,
right, and it is definitely better than the movie, which again is something people always say, but I mean, it's because it's mostly true.
Yeah, well, and because the book is written by a guy who is actually from Afghanistan and immigrated to the United States, and he's written several books. This is the only one that I've written, is The Kite Runner, which I think is probably his most popular.
Yes,
but he was came to America and was a doctor, and then just started writing, basically as a side, as a hobby. And then after he, became successful, he retired from being a doctor and now is only a novelist. And I think all of his books are either set in Afghanistan or have Afghans as the main character, or both.
Yes, and the other one I definitely recommend, again, I mentioned it before, was Thousand Splendid Suns, which I think is as good, if not maybe even better, than The Kite Runner. So I do highly recommend that one as well. But it really gives you a look into their lives here. And a few things that kind of are highlighted in this story that I don't think were necessarily as obvious in Charlie Wilson's War, although I think you did mention it to some extent. But so part of the conflict in the show is the Pashtuns versus the Hazaras. Mm-hmm. And so we had kind of talked about Afghan being named Afghanistan because it's the land of the Afghans, but so the Afghans are essentially the Pashtuns, but there are other ethnic groups within the country, and the Hazaras are the third largest group, but they're getting picked on, and that's kind of what we see is the family's servant and the kid's best friend is a Hazaran, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but that causes a lot of conflict with the bullies, and then even their own friendship, the kid starts to question it. Are we actually friends, or is it just because we live together and I'm your servant, and do you see me as subservient because I'm a Hazaran? And the kid almost feels bad because the Hazaran kid is so obsequious to him at times that he's just like, is he kissing up to me because he sees himself as less than me? Are we actually friends? And it's kind of complicated. And then the ultimate kind of conflict in the film, I hate to even talk about it. It is so awkward, especially in a PG-13 movie, that I'll just rip off the Band-Aid. So the bullies rape the kid who's the servant to the main kid. Yeah. And it almost feels out of place in this film. It doesn't feel like it's basically, it's disproportionate to the events that are going on. And then Amir then feels guilty basically for the rest of his life because he witnessed it and didn't step in.
Right.
Of course, it's not like he could do anything about it. They probably would have just raped him too.
But then
he lied about it after the fact, or right?
Right. He pretends that it didn't happen, or that he didn't know that it happened. And
that was the issue, right?
Right. And he
could have got the bullies in trouble and just pretended he didn't see anything.
Right. And is the little kid's name? Is it Hassan?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yes. And he, then he also kind of treats him like shit. He gets him kicked out and everything. Like, he does a lot more than just not stand up when he's getting like, he does a lot of stuff afterwards that he also feels really guilty about.
True. Yeah, exactly. He basically transfers his own guilt onto the other kid. Like, basically it's like, yeah, I'm going to pretend this didn't happen and I feel guilty about it, but you're not a good person for making me feel this way. And
right, yeah.
So his family leaves, and this kind of situation is never really resolved. And then decades later, in the year 2000, is when he goes back, finds out his friend had been killed by the Taliban, that he had a son who's now an orphan. And then it's a matter of tracking down this son to take him home. And they kind of reference that him and his wife can't have kids, so this is kind of their way to have a son. And again, that you find out is actually his nephew, because the kid's dad wasn't actually his dad. Amir's dad was his dad, but it was all kind of a family secret kind of thing. And again, all that feels kind of contrived within the movie, and it does work way better in the book. It's just about earning these things, which we've talked about. You have to set them up, and I think in the film, they're not necessarily set up well enough, but in the book, everything just feel a lot more emotionally impactful and earned. So, and to the extent of, I think I had kind of conflated some of this stuff maybe actually having happened to Khalid Hosseini, the author, and he's actually, I guess, has issues with that. So I think I even told you off air last time that the whole smuggling out of the country during the Soviet invasion in the tanker truck was something he actually did. It's like, oh, nope, I think I heard wrong, remembered wrong. It sounds like that had happened to people he knew, but he himself did not get out of the country that way. And apparently he's had a big issue with people assuming that things in his novels and stories are real, and basically wanting to ask him about that. And actually, I don't know if you saw this, like the actors in the movie, the studio or production company had to pay for them to get relocated because they were getting bullied over the things their characters did in the movie.
Oh, really?
And to the point, like, getting threatened and stuff. So the actors, the kid actors, actually had to get pulled and moved to different schools for their own safety, because of kind of the fallout here. So it was kind of controversial. And then Hosseini's actually taken like heat for like, well, why you got to make Afghanistan look bad? Or like, because he's just kind of being the author speaking the truth. And so Afghans will kind of confront him, not saying he's wrong, just saying like, why do you have to tell that story? It makes us look bad. Don't tell those stories. But again, I think an author's role is kind of to just shine a light on some of these injustices. And I think you almost, though, too, by showing the warts of a country or a people, you're showing their humanity. And I think it actually makes it easier to empathize with the Afghanis if you see these stories than it does if you just kind of have a two-dimensional view of them one way or the other.
Yeah.
So I did want to talk about then the Taliban itself, which we really didn't get to talk about in the episode of Charlie Wilson's War. We just kind of, that whole film just kind of set it up to the Taliban taking over. And as someone who has been to Afghanistan multiple times and the Taliban is still an issue there, why don't you kind of talk about the Taliban as far as, I don't know, just kind of as best you can as far as coming to power, or then also maybe a little bit about Sharia law and just kind of what their goals were and where we're at today with the Taliban.
So the Taliban is kind of, they refer to themselves, like their name for themselves is the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They did not come to power like directly after the Soviets left. There was a lot of infighting between different militia groups, but they did end up taking power in 1996. So they ruled the country from 1996 until 2001, which in a couple episodes we'll find out why they lost control of the country in 2001. But so for 5 years they ruled the country, which, yeah, like you said, I thought that it was a lot longer than that, but I guess there really was no, big group that held control of the country between the Soviets leaving and then 1996 when the Taliban took over. But they're basically Islamic fundamentalist extremists. They enforce Sharia law, so it's a, Islamic religious law in the country, like you see in the movie with the public executions for stuff like adultery. But they still hold quite a bit of power inside Afghanistan today. There are definitely regions of the country that are still essentially under control of the Taliban, or at least very influenced by the Taliban, and they are still a political organization, and they're actually the political organization that the United States government is in talks with at time of recording to try and broker some sort of peace deal to allow American forces to leave after almost 20 years that we've been there.
Basically say, hey, we'll leave if you don't take over the rest of the country again, kind of thing?
Not necessarily. I think they basically well, it's pretty much a given that they're going to have control of the country again, or at least parts of the country. But I think the main thing is trying to ensure that they don't start having like state harbored terrorist organizations in their country, because a important distinction to make is between the Taliban and then groups like Al Qaeda,
right,
and ISIS, or in Afghanistan, ISIS-K. Those are like terrorist organizations, whereas the Taliban is
a restrictive regime within a country. Right?
It's a restrictive regime, right, within the country of Afghanistan. Even like they were definitely buddy with those organizations, but they are not planning and carrying out terrorist attacks.
Right.
They just provided safety and security and for people who did. So that's like the biggest thing is, keeping the Taliban from harboring terrorists again in the future, which is kind of the reason, which we'll get into in our 9/11 episode, but it's kind of the reason why they, got destroyed by the United States in the first place, because they weren't willing to hand over Osama bin Laden after 9/11.
Yeah, so unfortunately, our mission was never to liberate Afghanistan. It was to eliminate the risk of terrorism to the Western world. So sorry, Afghans, but that's not necessarily our, I hate to say job or responsibility, because, to what extent did we open up the door for the Taliban to take over in the first place? But yeah, it's a mess.
Right. And it's like, you go in to try and, eliminate Al Qaeda. Well, to do that, you have to invade Afghanistan, and to do that, you have to cripple the Taliban regime. So it's kind of a domino effect. And then by the time you're done, well, now there's this giant power vacuum, and you can't just leave because the Taliban is essentially a direct result of just cutting and running the first time.
Right. And yeah, it's a mess. Like I said, and we will get more into that in the future here. And probably the last thing I wanted to talk about is this whole kite fighting thing in general, and kind of the title of the film. And this is a sport that just doesn't really exist in the Western world, but is super popular in the Middle East and other countries. And it is kind of interesting. So the whole idea, the only reason it's called the Kite Runner is that they fight kites and you try to cut the other person's kite down by literally cutting their string with your string. And then a kite runner will go and try to basically claim the fallen kite. It almost seems like the custom is once it's been cut, whoever gets to it first now owns that kite. And everyone's okay with that. It's like, yep, you got to buy the kite, but if yours kite's cut down, you lost your right to it unless you can get there first.
Yeah.
And so the main kid's friend, Hassan, is kind of a really, really good instinctive kite runner. He just kind of knows where to be. And so that's why the movie is called The Kite Runner. It's actually not named after the protagonist. It's named after the protagonist's friend. And what I thought was crazy, too, is doing a little research on kite running. And they actually coat the string with, well, glue makes it harder, but then also powdered glass.
Yeah. I read a biography of Colin Powell when I was like, oh man, I was probably in like 4th grade or 5th grade. I don't remember. I think it was when he was the Secretary of State.
Okay.
So whenever that would have been. Yeah, he talks about, because he grew up in New York, I believe, and he was doing the same thing, having kite battles, and he said that they would like get glass bottles and break them up and then put the broken pieces on train tracks. And the train would run over it, and it would basically pulverize the glass into a really fine powder. Then they would put glue on the string, and then put it in the powdered glass, so it made the string like really abrasive to where if you ran into another kite or another kite string, it was like razor wire basically to slice right through it.
Right. And it almost looks silly in the movie, like the way they're flying these kites and controlling them in such a way that they're actually having that much control over whether it's more than just luck if you cut this other string. But then I watched a YouTube video about, again, I don't know if they were specifically Afghani, but other people who had this custom in New York flying these kites, and nope, they're maneuvering it the exact same way, and it's just like, nope, I just don't know how it works, and that's actually a good depiction of how you do it. I'm kind of surprised Colin Powell got into it. Did he live nearby one of these cultures that was, or I guess, what's his background? It kind of surprised me that he was into it.
I don't remember. Like the only thing that I remember is that he flew the kites, and then they put the glass. I don't remember if it was like specific to some sort of like Central Asian thing, or if it was just happened to be a thing that he did growing up that was the same thing that these kids did.
And the one thing too that we're thinking, like, well, if they got glass on them, wouldn't they just be cutting their hands? But I'm guessing they probably just put the glass on the higher up part, not the part you're actually controlling. But I
think it's just the first however many feet from the kite, because then the rest of it doesn't really matter, because none of that's going to be anywhere close to the kite.
But I did see a lot of these guys in the YouTube video I found, they all had their fingers wrapped with like pretty thick tape and stuff, so you could let the string slide along your fingers and not worry about getting them cut. And it was kind of interesting. But in the movie they don't really show any of that. Just kind of interesting tradition that these little sports you don't think about. I mean, it never occurred to me that fighting with kites was ever a thing anywhere, even until this book and movie came out. And then you're like, oh, okay, that's a sport I've never heard of, and actually kind of looks kind of fun.
I did want to bring up I don't know if you would call it a tradition or a custom. That's probably a really generous name for it, but I guess we'll go with custom. Custom called the Bakabazi, or the dancing boys. Sometimes they're called chai boys. Bakabazi it's a Dari word. It means boy play, and it's young boys like the kid that you see in the movie around that age that dance for groups of older guys and serve them tea and stuff, and it's heavily connected to like child prostitution. A lot of times they're sexually abused, and it's one of those things. It was technically illegal under Taliban law, under the Taliban regime, but it's still a very common practice even today in Afghanistan. It's a really common practice. And there have been even like controversial stories of American military officials either sweeping under the rug or ignoring the practice to try and garner support from either Afghan military commanders or police commanders or groups that they're trying to gain favor with, maybe a village elder or something. But so in the movie, where he's dancing with the little bells on his ankles and they're clapping along, like that's not something that's made up just for the movie. It's not exaggerated at all. It's actually really common, and it happens all the time.
Gotcha, right? Because it's probably easy to see the movie and just see like, oh, this is just kind of some perverted thing they kind of threw in here to kind of heighten the tension, and it's like, no, this is a common practice.
Right. It's easy to look at that and think, oh, well, that's something that they made, like that's just because the guy is like a creepy villain that they made that up for him. It's like, no, that's
a thing.
That's common. Yeah. that happens all the time.
Interesting. Which is so weird because it's almost one of those weird things where they actually don't consider it a homosexual thing. Like it's almost like tangent. It's like separate from that because obviously Islam doesn't allow. Well, I guess you did say it was officially banned by the Taliban, but they kind of do it anyway, just as a custom.
Right.
I don't know, but I feel like they see. I guess I don't know enough about it. I feel like they would classify it as different than a same-sex adult relationship. That it's kind of like a separate thing. The same people who are doing this aren't necessarily, dating adult men their age. It's like they only have this little thing on the side. Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. It's ancient Greeks kind of would do similar things too with the whole catamites and stuff like that. So it's kind of it's not even just within the Arab world here. So the other thing I was going to mention about Sharia, which actually, so on Wikipedia, it actually says Sharia law is technically redundant, that Sharia itself means law. So it's the kind of that Islamic law. So Sharia law is technically redundant. So I want to talk about the Handmaid's Tale and how it's easy.
See, I haven't seen Handmaid's Tale. Is this supposed to be like not an analogy, but is this supposed to be like Sharia law?
Essentially, it's Christian Sharia takes over the U.S.
And
so basically the point is that as much as we definitely decry Sharia law and we don't want to see it in a place like the Taliban taking over drives us crazy and we're like, oh, this is so gross, and these Islamic fundamentalists that are taking over and forcing the extreme version of their religion on the populace. But then at the same time, a lot of the stuff that maybe they're doing is literally in their religious text. And so when you look at something like A Handmaid's Tale, everything they're doing, they are justifying with scripture, even if it's in such a way that's fictionalized and no one in the U.S. actually believes these things. But they're pulling stuff from the Bible to justify these extreme actions. And it basically, so The Handmaid's Tale basically is kind of showing a version of Christian Sharia taking over the U.S. in a way that obviously seems totally unrealistic, but at the same time, it is happening maybe in these Muslim countries. And, I'm not saying it could happen here, but it's almost like a what if, and, where do we draw the line on some of these things? If people are justifying legislation that's based off their faith, well, is that become its own slippery slope that maybe we don't talk about? And like, oh, if you're going to follow it by the letter of the law, you mentioned the stoning for adultery. Well, yeah, that's in the Bible too, right? We just now don't do it anymore. So you could easily see a group saying, well, it's in the book, so we're going to justify it and start it back up. That's basically why you can see a country like Afghanistan, to kind of bring it all back. In 1978, they were more progressive, but then a more traditional group comes in and says, nope, the book says this, so we're going to do it this way. And you got to have a beard. We're going to stone adulterers, and just, it's scary and maybe not as far removed from our own world as we like to pretend, I guess. Yeah.
And there's differing kind of degrees of how Sharia law is implemented. So like, there are some countries where, like we see in the movie, it's 100%, everyone has to abide by it, and you're punished in accordance with it, whether or not you are a Muslim or not. But then there are, other countries, like for instance, if you go to like the United Arab Emirates, right? You go to Dubai, like technically that country, it is, like the name says, it is an Arab emirate. So there are Muslim laws that apply to people in that country to a certain extent, but at the same time, they recognize that not everyone in their country is Muslim. So they have freedom of religion in their country. Like there are synagogues and there are churches, and not as many as there are mosques, but they do exist. Yeah, it's kind of weird, like how they apply certain rules. Like, for instance, I was flying through there once, and it was during Ramadan. And so when you're in the airport during Ramadan, Muslims aren't allowed to eat during from sunup to sundown. So if you were out in the terminal, you weren't, and it was daylight, you weren't allowed to eat. It was actually against the law.
Oh, interesting.
But they allowed the restaurants, you could serve food, and you could go to one of like a restaurant in the terminal and eat. You just couldn't do it out in the terminal.
Oh, interesting. So you still could break the law, so to speak, but just you
could go to a restaurant and eat if you wanted to, but if you brought, to do it outside of, basically they said that the businesses were free to operate however they wanted to in the airport, but out in the terminal, in the common area, you were not allowed to eat. during daylight hours during Ramadan.
Okay. And is it technically a dry country as far as alcohol?
Yeah, so it's not, you can like buy and sell alcohol there. There's bars, there's clubs, there's restaurants where you buy, but there's no, it's against the law to make alcohol there. So there's no such thing as like a distillery or a brewery or something.
Oh, gotcha. So it's all imported. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was saying the other one I heard I thought was that women can't wear bikinis, right, on the beach, or is that somewhere else? Maybe.
Well, it depends on what beach you go to, but I mean there are beaches where it's not enforced, like it's
Okay, but maybe frowned upon even if it's not enforced.
No, not necessarily. Just because like on the beach, a lot of those are like touristy areas, right. So they which again it's kind of it's not really like defined, but as long as it's not anything too crazy, you're probably okay.
Okay.
And also like there are like rules against public displays of affection there.
Oh, okay.
But
most of them are they're kind of cultural. It's like it's offensive and inappropriate, but not necessarily like you're getting it arrested.
Oh no, you can be arrested.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which and they're not robots. Like you're not going to get arrested and put in jail for like hugging your wife or holding your wife's hand or even like your girlfriend or whatever. But if you're having like a makeout sesh on the beach, and a cop is walking by, he'll probably come over and say something to you. But, he won't just straight up arrest you.
Okay.
But he could.
Oh, wow. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So, yes, before we get into 9/11, we're going to look at a couple other issues here over the next couple weeks. The first is a favorite movie of mine that will deal with the Maori people in New Zealand, the 2002 film Whale Rider.